The waiting room of the Menvari Clinic on Orth Ven smelled the way all waiting rooms smell regardless of species or galaxy, of recycled air, quiet anxiety, and the specific olfactory misery of a cleaning product that was never quite designed for the surfaces it was used on. Eli Voss had been sitting in it for 23 minutes, which was long enough to have read 4 pages of his book, eaten half a sandwich in defiance of a holographic sign that politely informed him in 17 languages that food was not permitted in the clinical zone, and conducted a detailed informal study of the ceiling panels, 2 of which were flickering in a way that suggested the station's maintenance backlog had reached the Menvari Clinic's lighting system at last. He was not concerned about the appointment. He was not concerned about much, which was either a personality trait or a coping mechanism, and he had long since stopped trying to determine which. The screening was mandatory, biennial, required for continued residential clearance in any multi-species territory under colonial compact jurisdiction, and he had done it once before, 2 years ago, when he had first arrived on Orth Ven to take the logistics coordinator position that his supervisor on Earth had described as a great opportunity, and that had turned out to be accurate in the specific way that surviving a shipwreck builds character. The first screening had taken 38 minutes and had produced a clearance document and a mild recommendation to consume more calcium. He expected roughly the same today. He had brought a book for the waiting and a sandwich for the waiting and a second sandwich in his bag for after, because optimism is its own kind of science. Around him, the waiting room held its usual collection of the station's resident species in various states of patience. 2 Dravathi merchants sat near the far wall, tall, rust-colored, with the kind of formal posture that suggested they were important people who found being made to wait a personal insult. One of them had 4 arms crossed and 2 resting in what Eli had come to recognize, after 2 years of working logistics on a multi-species station, as deep and eloquent contempt. A young Sulhari academic near the door had arranged her documents 3 times since he'd sat down. She was arranging them again now. Eli empathized. He was the kind of person who also rehearsed what he was going to say to a doctor and also knew it would accomplish nothing. The intake desk was staffed by a holographic interface that cycled through greeting scripts in the 17 official languages of the colonial compact, and one unofficial one that appeared to be a clerical error no one had corrected, which meant every 4th patient was welcome to the clinic in a dialect of old Vethani mercantile code that had not been in active use since the previous century. Eli had greeted it back in the same dialect when he checked in, because he had looked it up after the first time, because he was that kind of person. The clinic itself was all pale, smooth stone and bioluminescent panels tuned to a frequency of calm that worked adequately on no one and mildly on everyone, which was, he supposed, the best you could do when your patient population included beings who experienced light, sound, and the concept of furniture in 17 different ways. He had been told, when he first moved to Orth Ven, that the Menvari were considered the finest physicians in the known galactic community. He had also been told that they knew it. Both pieces of information had turned out to be accurate. His previous attending physician had been professional, thorough, and possessed of the particular manner of someone who is technically listening to everything you say, but has already arrived at the correct answer. A door opened at the far end of the room. A Menvari physician walked through it, called a name in Sulhari, and collected the academic, who gathered her documents with the efficiency of someone who had, after all, been ready for quite some time. As she passed, the physician glanced across the waiting room with the brief, assessing look of someone who does it automatically. She had the bioluminescent lines along her jaw at rest, silver pale, calm. She had the slightly too composed quality of a person who has learned to project stillness rather than feel it. Eli glanced up from his book. She glanced at him. He gave the small, neutral nod that humans use to acknowledge the presence of another person in a shared space without initiating anything further. She returned it with the precise, minimal courtesy of someone who has performed that exchange 10,000 times and walked through the door, and it closed behind her, and she did not yet know his name, and she was still, in every possible sense, perfectly fine. The holographic desk called his name 6 minutes later. He put his book away, wrapped the remaining half of his sandwich, tucked it back into his jacket pocket, a decision that was immediately and comprehensively catalogued by the Dravathi merchants 4 nostrils each, and walked through the clinical threshold into the rest of his afternoon. The examination room assigned to V. Schillen was the third on the left corridor, which she preferred because it had a window. Most of her colleagues considered the window a liability. Patients who stared out of it were patients who weren't paying attention. But she had practiced medicine for 31 years and had arrived at the private conclusion that a patient who needed to look out a window while answering questions was usually a patient with something worth asking about. She noted people's relationship with windows the way other physicians noted resting heart rates. It told her things. The human sat in the diagnostic chair with the particular quality of relaxation that she had come to associate with his species specifically. A looseness in the shoulders, a kind of ambient ease that was not the same as indifference but existed in the same neighborhood. He had, she noticed, a slight rectangular bulge in his jacket pocket that had not been there in his intake photograph, and that corresponded precisely to the dimensions of a standard food item, which meant he had eaten in the clinical zone, which meant he had read the sign and made a decision about it. She decided not to address this. She had enough to do. She asked the intake questions. He answered them with the cooperative brevity of someone who found the process mildly tedious but held no particular grievance against it. Age 31. Logistics Coordinator, Orbital Freight Division. Last physical examination 14 months prior, conducted by a human physician at the station's secondary medical post. Known allergies. 1. A topical adhesive compound used in certain Vethani wound dressings. She noted this. She moved to the medical history. The file loaded in the soft blue column of her diagnostic display, and she began to read, and the first 3 entries were entirely unreasonable in their normalcy. A fractured bone in early adolescence, a minor dermal infection, a documented reaction to a food compound. And then she reached the 4th entry and her reading pace slowed slightly, the way a person slows when they are walking in low light and think they may have seen something move. Tevhari hemorrhagic fever. She cross-referenced the pathogen designation automatically, the way she always did, before processing the outcome notation. And the database returned its assessment, and she read the survival probability for beings with comparable immunological architecture. And she looked at the outcome notation, and the outcome notation said recovered, and then said age 11, and she sat with that for a moment. She moved forward. She was a professional. The next entry was a gram-positive bacteremia strain she recognized from a paper she had read in her 2nd year of residency. A paper she remembered because her instructor had used it as a case study in the particular class that covered infections which escalated to multi-system involvement so rapidly that intervention windows were measured in hours. The outcome notation said recovered. The age notation said 19. She cross-referenced. She read the population-level mortality data for this pathogen across the 12 species in her database with applicable biology. She looked at it for a moment longer than she looked at most things. Eli, across the room, was looking out the window. He had the expression of a man thinking about dinner. She moved forward. She was still a professional. By the time she reached the 6th entry, a neural parasitic infection that she recognized with the specific, cold precision of someone who has read about something in journals without ever expecting to see it in the field. The bioluminescent lines along her jaw had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, she hoped, to someone without the training to read them. But she was aware of it, the way you are aware of a sound you can't quite identify in a quiet house, and she was aware that the lines along the backs of her hands had joined them, which was less disciplined than she would have preferred. She cross-referenced the neural parasite against the Menvari Xenomedicine archive. The archive returned 4 documented survivals across all species, all observed cases, the entire recorded history of the infection in medical literature. 3 of them had been written up in the annals of xenobiology. One of them had been referenced in her doctoral thesis as an example of a statistically negligible outcome. Eli's file noted it between a workplace injury and a follow-up vaccination. In the same register, one might use to note a delayed transit connection. The follow-up notation from the attending physician said, "Patient presence well, cleared for full activity." She looked up at him. He had, she now confirmed, produced the food item from his jacket pocket and was quietly weighing something in his expression that she interpreted, correctly, as the internal calculus of whether the circumstances permitted eating in a clinical setting. He appeared to reach a provisional conclusion, which was to hold it rather than act on it, which she considered surprisingly measured given everything. "Mr. Voss," she said. Her voice was exactly right. 31 years in medicine, and her voice was always exactly right. "I have a few additional questions about your medical history, if you don't mind." He looked over at her with the open, unguarded expression of a person who does not yet know that a conversation is about to become interesting. "Of course," he said, "everything all right." "Everything is within expected parameters," she said, which was the most carefully constructed sentence she had spoken in several years, and he nodded, apparently satisfied, and looked back out the window. And she looked back at the 7th entry in his file, and the 7th entry was worse than the 6th, and the lines on her hands were no longer behaving the way she needed them to. The standard epidemiological cross-reference took 4 seconds to run. V. Schillen had initiated it almost without thinking, the way she initiated all parallel queries during intake reviews. A background process, automatic, thorough, the kind of procedural habit that 31 years of practice had made indistinguishable from instinct. She had been asking Eli about the bacterial infection at 19 while it ran. She had been noting his answers in the file while it returned its results. She had been doing both of these things with complete professional competence when the results populated her secondary display, and then she had stopped doing them, and for approximately 3 seconds she had simply read. The database had pulled Earth's planetary pathogen index. This was routine. What was not routine was the index itself, which she was now looking at for the first time with the specific attention of someone who has been given a reason to look carefully, and which was responding to that attention by being, in her considered medical opinion, completely unreasonable. "When you say the fever was something children got in your neighborhood," she said, keeping her voice at exactly the register she wanted it, "how common would you say that was?" Eli considered this with genuine thoughtfulness, which she was coming to understand was a characteristic mode of his. "I mean, pretty common," he said. "Most kids in the district got it at some point. It went around every few years. My sister got it the year before me, actually." He paused. She was fine, too. V. Schillen looked at the mortality cross-reference on her secondary display. She looked at it the way you look at a structural assessment of a bridge you are currently standing on. Then she looked back at him. "Most children," she said. "Yeah." He seemed to notice something in her tone because he added helpfully, "There's a vaccine for it now, has been for about 15 years. She made a notation in the file. The notation said, "Confirm Earth epidemiological data, query may have returned corrupt results." She knew the data was not corrupt. She made the notation anyway because it gave her something to do with her hands while the bioluminescence along them continued behaving in a way she found professionally embarrassing. She moved to the neural parasite. She had been constructing the question for the past 4 minutes, in the part of her mind that ran parallel to the parts conducting intake and processing database horror, and she had it ready. She asked it with the calm, interested tone she used when a case had become genuinely unusual, and she wanted more information without alarming the patient. Eli's face did the thing it did when he was actually thinking rather than reflexively answering, which was to go momentarily still, and then animate with the mild, retrospective interest of someone reviewing a memory they hadn't visited in a while. "That was a whole situation," he said. "We were doing a wetland survey. This was a contract job. I was 24, and the site assessment had flagged some biological caution advisories, but they were pretty standard for that class of terrain, so." He paused, "So we didn't think that much about it. And then about 2 weeks in I started getting the headaches." "The headaches?" Vishilin said. "Yeah. And I think the medical report called it intermittent spatial disorientation. But honestly, it was more like occasionally I would reach for something and my hand would go somewhere else instead." He looked briefly thoughtful, which was inconvenient on a survey site. But the field medic caught it fast, and they had me on the treatment protocol within the week, and after about a month it was mostly resolved. V. Schillen had the archive entry for the neural parasite open on her primary display. She looked at the treatment protocol section. The treatment protocol section was brief. It was brief because treatment was not, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, the part of the patient journey that required detailed planning. She looked at the field medic notation in Eli's file, which described the treatment administered and which was, she now understood, essentially a record of someone doing their best with very limited options, and somehow it had worked, and the follow-up report had said patient presence well, and she was looking at him presenting well right now, 31 years old, holding a sandwich, telling her about his hand going the wrong direction as though it were the mildly inconvenient punchline of a story, rather than a clinical detail from an event that should not have had a second act. "A month," she said, "give or take. I took 2 months off the contract to be safe." He seemed to feel this was the responsible part of the story, the part that reflected well on his judgment. Didn't want to rush it. She closed the archive entry. She opened Earth's Historical Disease Burden Index, and she read it, not the summary data she had pulled before, but the full longitudinal record, the one that went back through centuries of documented human medical history, and charted the rise and management and occasional elimination of the things that had been trying to end that species for as long as anyone had been writing it down. She read it the way you read something you are not sure you believe. The index was very long. Earth had been very busy. At a certain point, the index included a section on pathogens that had been successfully eradicated, which was its own category and which was longer than the entire active pathogen index of most of the worlds in her clinical database. Eradicated by a species that had been doing organized medicine for, in the galactic context, approximately 20 minutes. "Mr. Voss," she said, and her voice was still right, still exactly right, "did you, growing up, consider yourself to be in generally good health?" He looked at her with the expression of someone who found the question almost charmingly simple. "Yeah, pretty much," he said. "I mean, there was the fever and the parasite thing and the bacteremia, but outside of all that." He thought about it. Pretty healthy kid overall. She nodded. She made a notation. The notation said, "Follow-up required, Research Ethics Board referral priority." Then she looked at him sitting in the diagnostic chair in the quiet room, looking out the window again, comfortable, unbothered, and she thought about a planet she had never visited, and all the ordinary Tuesdays it had apparently been having, and she felt the bioluminescence along her jaw shift into a color she hadn't worn in a long time. The color her species produced when something has rearranged the furniture of the mind without asking permission first. V. Schillen closed the epidemiological index and sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment, which was something she did when she needed to decide what kind of physician she was going to be in the next few minutes. She had been doing medicine long enough to know that there were two ways to proceed when a patient's file exceeded the boundaries of your expectations. The first was to finish the intake, issue the clearance, and file the anomaly as a research notation that someone else would read in 6 months. The second was to close the intake form, fold your hands, and talk to the person sitting across from you like they were a person and not a data set. She closed the intake form. Eli noticed. She watched him notice a slight shift in attention, the way someone looks up when the ambient sound of a room changes. He looked at her hands, folded on the desk. He looked at her face. He had, she was certain, no framework for reading Menvari bioluminescence, but he was apparently the kind of person who understood that a change in register meant something even when he couldn't name what. "Mr. Voss," she said, "has anyone ever told you that your medical history is unusual?" He thought about it with the same genuine, unhurried consideration he brought to all her questions, which she had by now identified as one of his more disarming qualities. "My physician back on Earth said I had a robust constitution," he said. She seemed pleased. I think she used the word remarkable once, but in the way people use it when they mean fine but interesting. A pause. "Is there a problem with the clearance?" "There is no problem with the clearance," she said, which was true. "I would like to discuss your file with you if you're willing, because several of the conditions documented in your history are considered, in the broader context of galactic medicine, to be significantly serious." She watched his face. "More serious than your records suggest they were treated." He looked at her with an expression she was now beginning to read fairly well, which was the expression of a man receiving information that didn't yet have a place to land. "How serious?" he said. She considered how to answer this. "The hemorrhagic fever you survived at age 11, she said, has a documented survival rate across most species with comparable biological architecture that my database categorizes as statistically rare. Treatment requires intensive intervention. Outcomes are uncertain even with full clinical resources." She kept her voice level and informative. "Your record notes that your treatment consisted primarily of rest and hydration." Eli looked at her for a moment. "My mum made soup," he said. Schillen absorbed this. "The bacterial infection at 19, she continued, because she had started and the professional thing was to finish, is an infection my training covers in a module specifically dedicated to conditions that escalate beyond intervention thresholds. The module is 3 weeks long. The module has a practical component." She paused. "Your file notes a 14-day recovery and a return to full activity." He had gone still in the way he went still when he was actually processing something, not just receiving it. She could see the information arriving and being examined, and being placed against other information he already had, and she watched his face do the slow, honest work of a person who is not performing comprehension, but actually achieving it. "And the parasite," he said. It was not quite a question. 4 documented survivals, she said, in the complete archive of Menvari xenomedicine, across all species, all observed cases, all recorded history of the infection. 4, she let that be what it was for a moment. You are the 5th. The room was quiet. Outside the window, a cargo drone drifted past on its elliptical route, indifferent and mechanical and completely uninvested in the conversation happening on the other side of the glass. Eli looked at it. She let him look. "So when my field medic said I was lucky," he said slowly, "she was. She was correct," Schillen said, "though I suspect she did not know the full dimension of what she was saying." Something moved through his expression that she didn't have precise vocabulary for in any language she spoke. A kind of retroactive vertigo, the sensation of looking back at a landscape you've walked through and understanding for the first time how much of it was cliff edge. He looked at his hands. He looked at them with the specific attention of someone who has been handed new information about something they have owned their entire life without ever reading the documentation. "I just thought everyone got sick," he said. "Those things, they were just things that happened. The fever went through the whole school. Half my floor at university had the bacteremia at some point." He paused. "We called it the rough week." She had run the Earth Student Population Health Index while he was speaking. She did not tell him what the index said about the rough week. She would include it in the research application. "I would like to request your permission," she said, "to refer your case to our Xenobiology Research Division, not for any clinical reason. Your health is not in question. But your file represents something that my colleagues would consider." She selected the word with care. "Instructive." He looked at her. Then, and she had not anticipated this, he almost smiled. Not widely. Not with any performance in it. Just the small, private smile of someone who has arrived somewhere unexpected and decided, on reflection, that it is interesting rather than frightening. "Instructive," he repeated. "That's a good word for it." "It is the accurate word," she said, and something in her own voice surprised her, because it had lost the last of its clinical distance without her deciding to let it go. She completed the intake form. She issued the clearance documentation, marked the file for research follow-up, scheduled a return appointment in 6 months with a notation that it was to be assigned to her directly. She handed him the clearance across the desk, and he took it and stood, and she watched him move to the door with the unhurried ease that she now understood differently than she had an hour ago. Not as the ease of someone with nothing to worry about, but as the ease of someone who has been through enough that the category of things worth worrying about has been revised down considerably. At the door he stopped, he turned. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "When you were reading the file," he said, "before you said anything, were you afraid of me?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Briefly," she said. "Not of you, of what the file implied. There is a difference." She looked at him steadily. "I am no longer afraid." He nodded. Then, "Is it strange that knowing all this makes me feel, I don't know, not proud exactly?" Just he searched for it. Like all of it meant something, even the rough week. "No," she said, "it isn't strange." He left. The door closed. She sat in the quiet room for a long time, not opening the next file, looking at the window where the cargo drones moved in their patient circuits. She thought about a planet she had never visited and did not particularly plan to. A small, ferocious place at the rim of explored space that had spent several 100,000 years building people who treated the impossible as an inconvenience and the catastrophic as something you got soup for. She thought about the 5 documented survivals in her archive, and how 4 of them were journal entries, and one of them had just walked out of her clinic with a sandwich in his jacket and a clearance form in his hand. And she thought that the universe was, in the final accounting, considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than even 31 years of medicine had led her to expect. She opened the next file. She was, despite herself, smiling.